Welcome to a journey through time where history isn't just a memory, but a vivid landscape of events and emotions waiting to be explored anew. You find yourself beneath the vaulted stone arches of a medieval convent where incense lingers in the still air and candlelight flickers against thick stone walls. But tonight the stillness hides something warmer, something forbidden. This is no ordinary tale of saints and scholars. This is about those who broke the rules for love. And just to prepare you, you probably won't survive this if you were living back then. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't a right, it was a luxury, and sometimes a death sentence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I read them all. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest comfort and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step quietly through the cloister garden gravel crunching beneath your soft leather soles. It's nearing vespers and the sisters move silently in procession veils flowing like smoke. But one figure lingers, Sister Alice, her gaze tilted slightly toward the high walls where a knight often waits with the dusk. He's not supposed to be there. And she's certainly not supposed to be looking, but that's what makes it exciting. Her vows were spoken to God, but her glances belong to him. His name is Sir Thomas, he of the silver armor and ink-black eyes, a younger son with no land and too many secrets. Alice first saw him during Lent, distributing alms to the poor through the convent gate. That day she felt something tighten, not fear, but the thread of a story beginning. In a world where a woman's value was measured by her obedience, Alice had always been dutiful. She copied psalms, folded linen, kept her silence. But Sir Thomas made her laugh in a way that felt like prayer. And one night, just one, she met him in the orchard beyond the garden wall. The moon was too full. The air smelled of rosemary and wet grass. She remembers touching his cheek and thinking absurdly of Saint Cecilia. Maybe she was hoping for music. Historians still argue whether stories like this were real or embellished by later romance writers, but one surviving convent record from Yorkshire dated 1287 speaks cryptically of a novice dismissed for familiarities of an unchristian kind. No names, no punishment, just disappeared. What makes the story linger is the scrap of parchment found in a broken psalter. Centuries later, a love poem, written in a hand too clumsy for any trained scribe. It reads, "Thou art my light, where none see sin in thee, I find what prayers begin." Quaint, clumsy, but undeniably human. You wonder whether it was Alice who wrote it or Thomas. Or maybe both. Each line passed through the garden grate like smuggled bread. The nuns had a saying, "What is hidden from the abbess is not hidden from God." But God, as it turns out, has rarely been good at keeping secrets. Some scholars suggest that love like theirs, quiet, private, and defiant, may have been more common than we think. In enclosed orders, emotion still existed, and where emotion simmers long enough, love often bubbles up, even when no one's allowed to drink from the pot. You trail your fingers along the cloister column, tracing ivy-carved stone. The wind shifts. You almost hear footsteps soft, hurried, hopeful. A veil fluttering, armor clinking just out of sight. The convent remains silent in the records. No public scandal, no trial. But some visitors say that if you stand by the old olive tree under moonlight, you might still catch a shape in the shadows, two shapes actually. One cloaked in wool, the other shining faintly in imaginary chainmail. And then, just like that, they're gone. You stay a little longer, though, listening. Because love, even hidden love, leaves an echo. You step into the great stone halls of Aquitaine where the air smells faintly of parchment beeswax and something sharper like rivalry polished to a gleam. The year is somewhere in the 12th century, and the woman commanding the room is Eleanor. Not just any Eleanor, the Eleanor of Aquitaine, of England, of Crusades, courtly love, and allegedly clandestine flirtations. She's sharpening a quill, or maybe a plan. Eleanor of Aquitaine was no stranger to scandal, but even so, the whispers about her private life curl through the centuries like perfume in a warm room. Queen to both Louis VII of France and later Henry II of England, she wielded power in a time when women were supposed to be ornamental, not operational. And yet here she is holding court with poets persuading kings, and if certain letters are to be believed, breaking hearts in private ink. The story that draws you in begins with the rumor that Eleanor, during her time in Poitiers, initiated a court of love, a place where noble women judged matters of romance real and imagined, and where troubadours sang lyrics a little too personal. Some even say she fell for one of them, or several. Historians still argue whether these courts existed at all or were just fantasy stitched into ballads, but something undeniably magnetic happened in her circle. A cache of letters from the period authorship debated endlessly hint at a queen writing to a man not her husband. One includes a passage: "You sang not to the court but to my chamber, and I was no longer queen but woman." That line alone could make a monk weep into his cassock. The identity of the recipient remains a mystery. Some speculate it was Bernard de Ventadorn, a courtly poet whose verses brimmed with longing. Others suggest a foreign knight she met during the Second Crusade, where she traveled not as a docile wife but as an armored presence commanding more attention than the relics themselves. Henry II, her second husband, was famously jealous, and their marriage turned bitter enough that she eventually supported their sons in a rebellion against him. Love gone sour. Power play or retribution for private wounds we'll never fully read. A lesser-known document from an abbey near Fontevraud describes a noblewoman, often in correspondence with men of verse, though her husband disapproved. It's vague, yes, but not dismissive, like a nod passed under the table. Of course, Eleanor never confirmed anything. Queens didn't write tell-alls, but her choices left trails. She surrounded herself with women who were educated, opinionated, and not shy about expressing desire, however veiled in metaphor. Some of them no doubt took their cues from her. It wasn't just about seduction, it was about claiming choice in a world where most women were exchanged like livestock. There's also that cheeky bit from her crusade days when she and her ladies allegedly dressed as Amazons. It's likely exaggerated, but if you're imagining Eleanor galloping across the Levant in gilded armor and a knowing smile, you wouldn't be alone. Back in Poitiers, you pass through her stone halls. Everything feels just slightly overheated. Words echo in alcoves where poets once rehearsed dangerous verses. You catch a line half remembered. She wears the sun like a mantle and burns what she touches. Maybe it was about Eleanor. Maybe it was for her. A fringe theory even more outrageous suggests that Eleanor used coded references in manuscripts to communicate with lovers, embedding phrases into religious texts that only her circle could decipher. The evidence thin. Fascinating, oh deeply. You picture her late at night writing by candlelight, not state letters, but something softer. Folding it just so. Sealing it with wax and breath. Of course, kings had spies, so she got clever. Poems instead of names, flowers instead of dates, and sometimes nothing but a pressed feather slipped between 2 pages of psalms. If she was ever caught, the consequences would have been ruinous, but she wasn't. And even in death, buried in a tomb carved with open books and regal lions, she's still whispering. The love stories she may have lived are scattered across Europe like breadcrumbs. No single trail, just glints in the dark. You leave the chamber quietly, One last draft from the window carries the scent of parchment candle wax and maybe just maybe a perfume worn once in secret. You step softly now into the dusky silence of a medieval monastery where rows of books, well, mostly chained manuscripts, line the cool stone shelves. Candles flicker low and quills whisper across parchment. You're in the scriptorium where holy men labor by lamplight to copy the word of God. But some of them, it seems, have been copying other things too. You notice two monks seated side by side, elbows nearly touching. Their robes rustle when they shift, but their eyes rarely meet. Only when no one is looking does Brother Martin pass a small, folded scrap of vellum beneath the edge of a psalter. Brother Julian's hand finds it hours later while pretending to check his inkwell. This is not quite the love story anyone would expect from a monastery, and certainly not one anyone was supposed to write down. But love, or something warm and watchful, did bloom in places like this between walls, meant to suppress all such things. You watch them work for hours. Their duties are precise, repetitive, holy. But their fingertips touch the same margins, and when their eyes meet, it's never during the daylight hours. Historians still argue whether romantic or even physical relationships between monks were tolerated, ignored, or severely punished. Records are scarce, often deliberately erased, but every now and then something survives marginal doodles poetry in the back of a hymn book or a scribbled phrase in Latin that definitely isn't from the Gospels. One 13th century codex now housed in a library in Cambridge includes a faint passage in the bottom corner of a page. God sees what the abbey hides, but what the heart knows the ink keeps. It's unsigned. But nearby are two names, Martin and Julian, written 3 times over, each a little darker than the last, like someone coming back to it during long secret evenings. Of course, scholars debate the authenticity. Was it an act of rebellion? A moment of weakness? Or perhaps just a very bored copyist indulging in wishful fiction? But other evidence, quieter, messier, suggests that these sorts of relationships existed all across Europe. In one instance, a monk in Bavaria was excommunicated not for a doctrinal error, but for clandestine intimacies, and his personal belongings included a love poem written in Greek. The margins of medieval manuscripts are filled with strange art snails fighting knights, monkeys playing lutes, and occasionally two men embracing. Many assume satire, some suspect metaphor, but a growing number of fringe historians argue these could be private jokes or even glimpses of real affection hidden in plain sight. You glance again at the two monks. Their faces are calm, blank to the world, but something electric hums in the spaces between them. They speak with silence, too much silence, too carefully held. Later that night, in the cloister garden, Brother Julian leans against a column, half-shadowed. Brother Martin approaches. No words, just the passing of a book or maybe a hand grazing a robe. There are no lovers' names carved in the monastery walls, no songs composed in their honor. But in the tiny cramped script of their manuscripts, you can see the ghost of something private, hidden in footnotes, folded between psalms, encoded in capital letters that curve just a little too luxuriously. These stories rarely end well. Separation, exposure, transfer to other abbeys, or simply a cold wall between them forever after. But in the ink and in you, they're still there, waiting. And in a way, they always knew someone would be watching someday, maybe even tonight. You find yourself now in a high-towered chamber warmed by tapestries and the faint scent of ink and beeswax. Outside, bells ring across the castle courtyard, but inside, the world narrows to 2 figures seated beside a carved oaken desk. A young princess with ink-stained fingers and a tutor whose voice lowers just slightly when he corrects her pronunciation. He's not much older, perhaps 10 years, but he holds all the power in the room, except when she tilts her head like that. Her name, Let's just say something vaguely royal and plausible, Isabella, perhaps. His master Alaric, a man trained at the university in Paris, but summoned here to the countryside court because the king wants his daughter to think in Latin. The first lessons are formal, grammar, ethics, the duller pages of Aristotle. But eventually Isabella's questions turn sharper. She quotes poetry he didn't assign. She begins to challenge, to argue, to dazzle. And Alaric, well, he starts staying a little longer after lessons, just to shelve books, or admire the view, or adjust his breath. There's a documented case, yes, truly, of a 14th century princess in Aragon who was tutored by a philosopher and later accused of being too free in correspondence. The letters, of course, were burned, but court gossip survives in marginal notes and clerical records. She learned well, one scribe wrote dryly. One scribe. Historians still argue whether such relationships were ever genuinely romantic or simply misunderstood, yet the patterns recur. Private instruction, shared minds, eyes that linger too long over a translation of Ovid. Speaking of Ovid, his Art of Love was technically banned in most Christian courts, but still copies were passed hand to hand like sacred contraband. One copy found in a noblewoman's personal chest had annotations in two distinct hands. One passage underlined twice reads, "Desire begins not in the heart, but in the mind when minds entwine." Quaint, dangerous. In this story, Isabella begins writing verse of her own. She reads it aloud under the guise of recitation practice. Alaric listens too intently. He corrects her rhymes gently. She smiles without showing her teeth. It's all terribly civilized until it isn't. Late one night, she leaves a page folded under his inkwell. Not poetry, just a question: if I were not a princess. What follows is not recorded, but not long after Alaric is reassigned to a remote estate tasked with tutoring the sons of a baron with more sheep than books. Isabella never takes another tutor. She marries at 18. The wedding chronicler notes her restraint and modesty. The phrase probably meant something else entirely, but you raise an eyebrow anyway. The castle where they met still stands half-ruined now, its library long looted. But one tapestry remains threadbare but detailed. It shows a young woman and a scholar seated beside each other at a window. Their hands don't touch, but the space between them crackles. One modern restoration expert noted a single gold thread running from her sleeve to his book. It's not in the original pattern. Was it added later? Or always there, too fine to notice until someone looked closely enough? Sometimes love is loud and reckless. Sometimes it's quiet, folded into the margins of a lesson plan. And sometimes centuries later, you're the only one who notices it was there at all. You arrive now in the candlelit hall of a noble estate in southern France, where laughter drifts like perfume and everything smells faintly of roasted chestnuts wine and roses pressed between letters. Music trickles from a corner, lute strings and low voices, and in the center of it all, a troubadour sings a love song. Not just any song. One so pointed, so vivid that every married lady in the room blushes slightly and pretends to examine her goblet. He sings, of course, in Occitan. It's a romantic language literally, the tongue of courtly love of longing that dares not act. His eyes scan the room but always return subtly to one woman, Lady Aveline, wife of Lord Raymond, who happens to be snoring softly at the high table. This is how it often worked. The noblewomen were adored in poems, their names disguised behind flowers or metaphors. The troubadours, often landless younger sons or ambitious poets, played the long game songs. Gifts, coded notes tucked inside prayer books. Their love was to be pure, but not that pure. Courtly love, or fin amour, was never meant to be consummated. Or so the church said. Historians still argue whether this entire tradition was sincere emotion or just a highly stylized social game. But the truth, like a good metaphor, usually lies somewhere in between. One particularly bold troubadour, Guillaume de Cabestany, was said to have composed so many verses for his patron's wife that her husband grew suspicious. The story ends badly. The husband allegedly murdered Guillaume and served the poor man's heart in a stew to his wife. Dramatic, yes, and possibly apocryphal, but the tale became legend, whispered in castles and repeated in taverns for centuries. Back in the great hall you watch as Lady Aveline lowers her eyes, smiling behind her veil. The troubadour catches it. There's a flicker of recognition. You know that look. That shared fiction that might not be fiction at all. The songs were full of imagery, flames, moons, locked towers, but sometimes they were remarkably explicit in what they couldn't say. One 13th century poem includes the lines, "I am her knight, though I wear no crest. Her glance is my banner, her silence my rest." A copy of that very poem was found scribbled in the margins of a clerical ledger, suggesting that even the estate's accountant got a little swept up in it. Later that night, the lady retires early, feigning a headache. The troubadour disappears not long after. A servant notices. But servants knew better than to speak. The tension in these relationships was the point. To love but not touch. To burn but never kindle. And yet, a few months later, Lady Aveline is sent away to the countryside for her health. When she returns, she walks a little slower and the troubadour is gone, replaced by a harpist with very poor aim. Not every story ends in scandal. Many ended only in longing. But in some cases, illegitimate children from noblewomen appear in records with curious notations like of uncertain paternity or placed in a monastery by special request. You walk now through the remnants of the estate, nothing more than moss-covered stone and a weathered stair. But one corner of the chapel still bears a carved rose, delicate, out of place, and facing east. Toward a road the troubadour once traveled, singing songs that should have been secret but somehow still echo here centuries later. You make your way now to a colder place, bleak stone walls and damp corridors echoing with the clatter of student sandals. This is Paris in the early 12th century, and you've entered the world of logic theology and one of the most famous forbidden love stories medieval Europe ever managed to preserve, Abelard and Eloise. He's a scholar, brilliant, confident, and slightly insufferable. She's his pupil, brilliant, insightful, and absolutely unamused by his ego, which naturally is what makes her irresistible. Peter Abelard is at the height of his intellectual fame, lecturing at Notre Dame, and tearing apart the arguments of lesser theologians like a cat with parchment. Eloise is young, yes, but not impressionable. She's already fluent in Latin and Greek. She challenges him in debate. She matches him quote for quote. And when he moves into her Uncle Fulbert's household as her private tutor, well, they stop quoting Aristotle quite so often. Their affair isn't speculative. We know it happened because they told us through letters. Not just love letters, but entire volumes of correspondence preserved through centuries. These weren't scribbled notes under cloaks. They were deeply emotional, theologically complex, and honestly a bit intense. You read lines like, "You know what you took from me, and how you left me only a shadow." Their love was intellectual first, but far from platonic. Heloise would later write that she cared more for your love than for heaven, which is not the sort of thing you say in confession. But things spiraled. They were discovered. Heloise became pregnant and was sent to Brittany to give birth in secret. The child's name was astrolabe, yes, like the medieval scientific instrument. It's quirky, it's niche, it's very them. To make things right, Abelard arranged a secret marriage. But Eloise refused to acknowledge it publicly. part pride, part strategy. Her uncle felt betrayed, and in one of history's more horrifying footnotes, Fulbert arranged for Abelard to be attacked and castrated by hired men. You wince understandably. The story isn't subtle. After that, everything changed. Abelard entered a monastery. Heloise became a nun. But they never forgot each other. Their letters continued layered with regret longing and a strange blend of love and theology. Heloise questioned God's justice. Abelard questioned everything, including his own motives. And both questioned whether love like theirs was ever truly possible in a world ruled by sin and penance. Historians still argue whether the letters were edited or even forged in parts. There's linguistic evidence suggesting multiple hands, but the emotions in them, undeniably real. One lesser-known manuscript found centuries later in a Swiss library includes a marginal note beside a copied passage from their letters. Their sins were of the heart, but their punishment was made for the flesh. Chilling, also deeply medieval. Their graves, originally separate, were eventually moved side by side. You can still visit them in Paris beneath a Gothic canopy in Père Lachaise Cemetery. Lovers leave letters and flowers. Some even whisper to the stones. You wander past their tomb, fingers brushing the ironwork. The air is heavier here, filled with the ache of unresolved longing. You don't know if they ever truly forgave each other or themselves, but you do know this: their love, though broken, endured in words. That's the thing about forbidden love in the Middle Ages. It often ended in separation, in cloisters, in stone. But unlike most stories that dissolve in silence, this one carved itself into the historical record with quill's ink and unbearable honesty. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's why we still read it. Now you walk not through castles or cloisters, but under the wide sky of a quiet manor estate where torches line the walkway, and the banners bear no coat of arms, just the faint colors of a lesser house. This is where you meet the squire. No name recorded, no song sung about him. Just a mention buried in a record of land disputes from 1312. The young squire dismissed from the lord's retinue for reasons not stated, but widely understood. That's all the official story says. But unofficially, you're about to step into a space where love dares not speak its name, and yet somehow does in glances, gestures, and one hastily packed satchel. The squire was clever, capable, and too attentive to his lord. Too quick to polish his sword, too loyal in tournaments, too familiar at the stables. The lord, young, unmarried, raised among stern knights and indulgent poets, perhaps didn't notice at first. Or perhaps he did and didn't mind. They spent long evenings together, hunched over chessboards, or riding along the edges of the property where no servants followed. A shared cloak on a cold night. A laugh held too long. A pause before dismounting. You know how this goes. In one preserved household roll from Burgundy, a steward records a curious expense. One embroidered kerchief blue gifted from Sir H. to the boy. No further details. But that kerchief appears again once in a record from the church court, listed among items reclaimed after improper dismissal. It had been tucked perhaps into the squire's trunk. Historians still argue whether these hints add up to what we think they do. After all, friendship between men close, affectionate, and even physical was common and acceptable in medieval society. It's modern eyes, we're told, that read too much into a touch on the shoulder or a shared bed during travel. But there's also the poetry. Not the famous stuff, but the odd fragments copied in personal notebooks or hidden at the back of hunting guides. One such poem preserved in a single copy in Lion reads, "No lady ever stirred my dreams, but he who stood in armor seems." The scribe wrote anonymous. He probably meant unspeakable. You find yourself watching a rehearsal for a hunting party. The lord, tall and noble, adjusts his gloves. The squire stands nearby, eyes too steady. Their conversation is quiet, quick, efficient, but something flickers between them. Maybe memory, maybe warning. A rumor spreads that Winter the squire's caught wandering from his assigned quarters. No details given, no trial held. Just a letter of dismissal sealed with the Lord's crest and a cold line he is no longer needed. A decade later, the Lord marries. The chronicles mention a lavish ceremony and a bride with quiet eyes. No mention of the squire nor of his service. But in one margin of the estate's chapel, you might notice a carved symbol, two helmets crossed at the brow, unusual and slightly crude. No family crest, just a sign. Someone carved it with care where no one would see unless they knelt to tie their boots. You kneel now. The stone is cool. And maybe, just maybe, you feel that old warmth. The kind born in silence, broken only when silence grew too heavy to bear. They say forbidden love leaves no legacy. But it's there between the lines, even if the world never wrote their names down. Now the air grows heavy with incense and suspicion. You've arrived at the court of Henry IV of England, and the woman drawing all eyes, both adoring and accusing, is Joan of Navarre. She's queen, she's foreign, and she's entirely too independent for the liking of many English nobles. But behind the titles and political maneuvering lies another thread, one that may or may not have involved a love story, hidden under the weight of sorcery, grief, and royal paranoia. Joan was no stranger to power. Before marrying Henry, she had already ruled Brittany as regent for her children. Widowed and still politically valuable, she married the English king in 1403. Their union on paper was diplomatic, but court accounts suggest a closeness that went beyond treaty ink. Joan and Henry shared books falconed together and dined privately. He even left her generous provisions in his will, one of the more romantic gestures available to a medieval monarch. But after Henry's death, everything shifted. Left a wealthy dowager with significant influence, Joan clashed with her stepson, Henry V. And then came the accusations, dark ones. In 1419, she was arrested and imprisoned on charges of witchcraft, the alleged crime attempting to use magic to poison the king. Historians still argue whether the charges were fabricated to strip her of her wealth, or if they stemmed from real fears about her knowledge of potions and charms. But here's the fringe detail that draws your attention: a mention in a French chronicle that Joan kept too frequent company with a Breton physician himself, a widower of keen mind and melancholic poetry. No name is given, but records from her household list one Master Etienne, a healer and astrologer retained for personal consultation. One expense note reads, "To Master Etienne for a concoction to soothe dreams and cool humors." Another more ominous, "To be prepared only when the moon wanes as per her instruction." Now you might just chalk that up to medieval medicine. But then there's a letter, undated, unsigned, tucked in a miscellany at Lambeth Palace Library. Written in French, it says, "Your hands do more than mend wounds, they pull me back from the fire." A romantic flourish, a forged artifact, or a whisper from Joan herself, preserved like a pressed rose between old vellum. She spent 3 years under house arrest, cut off from her income, her jewels confiscated. Yet she was never tried, and the charges were quietly dropped in 1492. Historians suspect her son-in-law, the Duke of Bedford, intervened, possibly aware that keeping a queen accused of witchcraft in prison without evidence made for awkward politics. When she was released, Joan resumed her role with quiet dignity. But Master Etienne disappears from the records. One theory, he died in her service. Another, more romantic, that he fled England under a false name, a satchel of herbs and letters in hand. You imagine them in a shadowed corridor before the arrest, his fingers trailing over her wrist as he checks her pulse. The pause a little too long, the silence a little too intimate. They say Joan wore only black after Henry's death, but one surviving inventory of her possessions lists a single silk ribbon in deep forest green tucked inside a book of alchemical notes. Not a color associated with mourning, but perhaps with memory. You leave Joan's story not at the point of betrayal, but at the window of her confinement, a narrow slit through which she watched the seasons change. She had no spells to free herself, no prince to ride in, just a name she no longer spoke, and maybe a pulse that still quickened in the quiet moments when the moon waned and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and bitter orange peel. Now you walk beneath sun-scorched arches and past faded mosaics where the scent of dust, myrrh, and sea salt lingers in the air. You're not in England anymore. You've followed whispers east and south to the lands touched by the Crusades, and to a story rarely told, the tale of a king who came back from Jerusalem, not alone, but with a woman he never officially married. Or if he did, no one was allowed to say so. His name, at least in this version, is King Amalric of Jerusalem, a Crusader monarch who, according to official records, took a Byzantine bride named Maria. But some fringe accounts contradicting the carefully scribed annals tell a different story. They speak of a second woman, one not from a royal house, but from the coastal cities Tyre perhaps or Acre. She may have been a healer, or a widow, or both. She certainly wasn't nobility, but she traveled back west with the Crusader retinue, her name erased from the records, and yet traces remain. In a letter housed in a minor archive in Palermo, a monk laments, "The king is entranced by the Eastern woman who reads stars and oils his wounds as if to claim his soul." Not exactly subtle. She wore no crown. She attended no coronation. But several chronicles mention a foreign woman of dark hair and strange speech, who lived in the royal quarters and was rarely seen, though often guarded. Some said she was a concubine, others a sorceress. One scribe, perhaps a romantic, called her his shadow queen. Historians still argue whether Amalric's second union following his political marriage ever happened at all. But odd inconsistencies exist. Land granted without clear heir royal decrees, signed with a mysterious second hand, and a break in diplomatic relations with Constantinople, perhaps not over trade but over affection. Even more curious, a birth record from a convent in Provence lists a child of noble but unproven descent whose guardian arrived from the east bearing a letter in Greek and an amulet etched with a cross and crescent. That child was educated, funded, and eventually married into minor nobility. The guardian, she vanished from the records entirely like a tide rolling back, leaving only footprints in wet sand. You try to picture her now, standing at the rail of a ship bound west, her robes fluttering, hand resting on her belly or a book. Or perhaps just the rail, wary of what she's leaving and of what she's entering. One 19th century historian prone to over-romanticizing claimed to have found her burial site in France, an unmarked grave near a Crusader chapel, where an Eastern-style oil lamp was discovered. The claim has been dismissed by most scholars, but the lamp exists, and someone lit it. There's no official story here, no marriage certificate, no poems carved in stone. Just glimmers in letters, erased names, and the silence of chroniclers who knew better than to write down what they really saw. But the king never remarried after her. And when he died, his will included an anonymous bequest. "For she who soothed my pain when none else dared. You linger by the sea now where the waves strike stone and the gulls cry overhead." Somewhere in that sound, maybe you hear her voice, low, accented, steady. A voice never welcomed by the court, but remembered by the man who ruled it. In the end, that was her rebellion, not power, not crown, but presence. A love hidden in the spaces history tried to sweep away. You stand now beneath the brooding sky outside the towering walls of York Minster, the stones slick with rain and the wind sharp enough to carry whispers. It's England in the late 1300s, and inside the cathedral complex where monks chant and incense curls skyward, something stirs beneath the surface, a story no chronicler dared to write in full. Two novices, Edmund and Thomas, arrive at the monastery within weeks of each other. Both young, both quiet, both eager to obey. But from their first shared glance across the refectory table, something delicate begins to unfurl. Not temptation exactly, not yet. Just recognition. At first they talk only during study. Latin declensions, psalms, candle maintenance, the usual novitiate routines. But then come the questions that stretch beyond assigned texts. The lingering in the library alcoves, the early morning walks in the cloister before the others stir. One friar would later remark vaguely that the two were entirely too fond of shared contemplation. And then came the thunderstorm. It was during Lent when silence was stricter and the rules more rigid. A brutal downpour began in the night, so loud it masked footsteps. By dawn, both novices were gone. The monastery did not ring the alarm. No official notice was made. But one parchment surviving in a water-damaged register includes a note brothers Edmund and Thomas removed from roll. See discretion. Historians still argue whether this phrase implied dismissal escape or something more permanent. York records from the time list no burials matching their names, no sightings, just absence. What remains, however, is the marginalia. In a psalter left behind in the novice's cell, there is a penciled line almost invisible. I will go with you through fire if it brings us into light. Elsewhere in the dormitory wall behind, where one bed once stood, someone carved a small symbol, two circles intertwined surrounded by a single flame. A recent restoration revealed it beneath layers of whitewash. Was it a love affair? A spiritual bond? A rebellion against a world of silence? Some modern scholars dismiss it all as romantic projection. Others argue that male companionship in monastic communities was often intense but not erotic, but others quietly, persistently point to patterns. Letters written but unsigned. Verses passed between monastic houses that echo with too much longing. A code of sorts made from shared prayers and longing looks. A 14th century manual for novice masters includes the instruction guard. Always the heart for it may err, even in cloistered peace. Sounds like someone knew exactly what they were talking about. You step now into the ruined cloisters of York, what's left of them. Moss climbs the walls. The sky presses low. And under one arch, faded but stubborn, there's graffiti scratched in Latins. They left not in shame, but in search of grace. You imagine them walking out into that storm robe's clutch tight faces wet with rain or something else. Maybe they had no plan, just the promise of elsewhere, of not here. No trace was ever found, no tale confirmed. But for centuries the monks of York would whisper that on stormy nights two figures could be seen at the edge of the woods, just beyond the abbey wall, walking slowly side by side. Not ghosts, just memory. You close your eyes. You hear the rain again. You feel the wind press your cloak to your back. And you wonder how many other pairs walked into the dark unseen, but not unfelt. You step now into a courtyard, dappled with sunlight and silks, where the rules of love don't so much bend as become a complicated dance. This is the High Court of Provence, or perhaps Toulouse in the 12th century, places where courtly love wasn't just an idea, it was a system. One with rituals, expectations, metaphors, and a strict code of silence. Here, noble women receive oaths not in back rooms but in formal exchanges. Knights kneel to offer their hearts, not their hands. And the women, often married off for political alliances, hold court with veils fans and deadly subtext. It's like a romantic chess match with a dagger balanced on every square. You enter just as a young knight, Sir Amory recites his latest canzo, a love song delivered to Lady Isolde. He's flushed his voice trembling, but she listens with polite neutrality the way one might admire a stained glass window, coolly, carefully, never too long. She cannot, after all, be seen returning affection. That would break the game. And make no mistake, it is a game. A dangerous one. For courtly love required secrecy above all. Admitting anything out loud turned longing into scandal, affection into treason. Historians still argue whether these relationships were platonic or deeply physical. Most likely they existed in every shade between. But one 13th century constitutionary rulebook for court behavior specifically bans knights from prolonged whispers with ladies in alcoves, which tells you just how frequently that sort of thing happened. A fringe document found in the Montauban archives includes a fragment of a knight's confession, likely under duress, where he admits to writing sonnets upon her glove and kissing the hem of her gown when no one looked. The priest's notation: excessive metaphor, insufficient contrition. Poetry from this period reflects both the obsession and the restraint. One verse reads, "I love her as fire loves the hearthstone, ever circling, never daring burn." Even that line might have been too bold depending on who overheard. Lady Isolde, for her part, responds with nothing but a glance. But later in her prayer book, discovered centuries later with a hidden compartment, lies a single parchment leaf. On it a sketch of a dove, and beneath it the phrase, "Mine eyes betray me not. My soul already has." That's the real trick of courtly love. Its truth is always in the silences. In the moments when someone looks too long at a window, or stays after vespers just a bit too late, the troubadours helped keep things plausible. They'd assign code names La Belle Sans Merci or The Rose Beyond Reach to mask real identities. Entire romances unfolded in ballads no one dared decode. Still, suspicions formed, and occasionally jealous husbands got the wrong idea or the exactly right one. In one known case from Gascony, a knight was found dueling a minstrel at dawn, allegedly over the phrase, "She is softer than snow on my bare tongue." The lady in question fainted mid-breakfast. Everyone pretended it was the heat. You walk now through a crumbling garden where carved benches and dry fountains once echoed with laughter sighs and oh-so-innocent strolls. Vines have crept over the old sundial. Someone carved two initials into its base, long eroded but still faintly there. Not all love is loud. Some wears velvet gloves and speaks in riddles. But just because it's hidden doesn't mean it wasn't real. Now the path leads you far from courts and cloisters, down muddy village lanes and through smoke-streaked cottages where the air smells of hearth ash, damp wool, and something sweeter. You're in a place without poets or parchment, where stories are passed mouth to mouth and love blooms behind closed shutters. This is where you meet her, the blacksmith's daughter. Her name isn't recorded, but the legend lingers: a girl with soot on her cheek, strong hands, and a laugh that could undo a man's balance faster than a spooked horse. And he's not from here. That much is clear from the shine of his boots and the cut of his coat. Some say he was a royal prince, others a bastard half-brother. The important detail: he was far above her station. He rode through the village one spring day on official business, surveying land, collecting dues, something dull and kingly, and stopped when his horse threw a shoe. The blacksmith came out, apron and scowl in place. His daughter came too, dragging a bucket of water and not meeting the prince's eyes. Not at first. That's how it begins, every time. He comes back, once for the horse, then again for repairs, then with no excuse at all. Historians still argue whether these local tales repeated in taverns, stitched into folk songs, ever actually involved royals. But parish records in one Yorkshire village show a noble visiting regularly for the supervision of an outlying estate for 3 years straight. The village priest in a grumbling side note wrote, "His Grace inspects the forge with great frequency." One assumes he is planning a metalwork revolution. You smile, of course he was. The two met under cover of twilight behind the smithy down by the river or in the old apple grove. They left little behind, no letters, no keepsakes. Just a wooden button found years later in a field too fine for a villager bearing the faint crest of the crown. Then she vanished. Well, not vanished, just taken to help her aunt in another town. A common story always with an aunt involved. But 9 months later, a baby was born at a convent 2 valleys over. The birth record lists the mother's name as Isabel and the father as unknown. But someone paid the convent double. The child grew up educated, eventually sent to a minor lord's household for service. One day he was knighted for saving that same lord's life in a skirmish and granted land. A small plot, but his own. Curiously, in the royal court rolls, an estate was quietly gifted to a certain knight without clear parentage, signed by a regent during a period of transition. Coincidence, perhaps. But in the village, the story stayed alive. Some claim the girl returned years later veiled, watching from afar, as the blacksmith hammered out horseshoes, never knowing if his daughter would walk through the gate again. Others said she died in childbirth, or joined a convent, or married a miller in secret. But in one version, a favorite among older women who tell stories after too much cider, she meets the prince once more years later at a market. Their eyes meet. No words, just a nod, a pause, and then he turns away. Somewhere near the forge, a single horseshoe hangs above the old doorway, rusted, bent, and mounted upside down. Not for luck, but maybe, just maybe as a quiet sign. That love lived here once. You find yourself now stepping into the echoing stone chamber of a cathedral residence, where candles burn low beside a desk piled high with parchment and sealed letters. The air is sharp with ink-old wood, and the faint bitterness of scandal barely contained. This is the home of a bishop revered powerful and, it turns out, very careless. The bishop in question is never named in the official records, of course, just the bishop of a great see in the west, according to a whispering 15th century Italian chronicle, but the fallout that's well documented. It all starts with a woman. Doesn't it always? She was married a merchant's wife, pious and well-dressed, known for her regular attendance at Mass and her generous offerings to the poor box. Her husband traveled often, which left her ample time for reading and for confession. With the bishop, frequently. At first it looked harmless. After all, bishops often gave private counsel, but the bishop started visiting her house at odd hours under pretext of pastoral care. And then came the letters. So many, one surviving servant said the ink never dried on the gate. One fragment still exists, found tucked behind a wall during a renovation centuries later. Its folds were faded, the Latin clumsy, but the meaning was clear. I have left off prayer. I remember only your mouth and the taste of the wine you held for me. Subtle he was not. Eventually someone talked. Perhaps a jealous rival. Perhaps a housemaid. The merchant husband returned, found one of the bishop's gloves on the bedroom table, and stormed straight past his own front door and into the courts. The bishop was summoned to answer for improprieties unbecoming the cloth. He denied everything, she denied more. But their correspondence, once intercepted, said otherwise. Historians still argue whether the bishop was truly stripped of his title or merely relocated to a quieter diocese. Some sources say he fled to Avignon. Others claim he lived out his life in a small seaside abbey, never again allowed to preach. As for the woman, she was sent to a convent, according to most accounts. One local tale insists she escaped en route and took a new name working as a herbalist in the hills. Another claims she died of fever and her ghost still knocks at the bishop's former quarters on stormy nights. Fringe scholars point to an obscure book of sermons published decades later under a pseudonym. Buried in one chapter on the Song of Songs is this line, "Let me taste thee with the longing of Solomon, but hide thee from the eyes of men." The writing style is familiar, a little too familiar. In one version of the story, the bishop left behind a hidden box in the cathedral archives, contents unknown, sealed with wax bearing a broken crest. That box, if it existed, has never been found. But the bishop's name, whatever it was, has been erased from nearly every record of the era, a silence louder than any bell tower. You stand now in his abandoned study. The hearth is cold. A single candle burns on the sill, a relic of the past. Dust dances in the light, and somewhere beneath your boots a floorboard creaks too soft. Perhaps he walked here waiting for word of her. Perhaps he never forgave himself. Or perhaps despite the ruin, he would say he'd do it all again. Even bishops fall, that's the quiet moral. And sometimes they write their confessions not in Latin but in longing. Tonight you kneel, yes, kneel beside a flickering candle in a tiny chapel where the walls are lined not with saints but with strange, vivid visions. This is the inner world of Marjorie Kempe, the medieval mystic whose reputation for holiness hysteria, and something far more human still, echoes through church pews and scholarly debates alike. Marjorie is best known for her tears unstoppable, public, and often unwelcome. She wept during sermons. She wept during communion. She wept so hard and so often that priests begged her to leave the church so others could concentrate. But Marjorie would tell you she couldn't help it. She was in love. Not with any earthly man, not technically. She claimed to be married to Jesus Christ. Spiritually, of course. But her descriptions were startlingly intimate. Her visions, recorded in what's widely considered the first autobiography in English, describe Christ appearing to her sitting beside her on her bed, calling her my darling, and even running his fingers through her hair. One entry reads, "He clasped her soul to him and kissed her inwardly so that she swooned with sweetness." You blush slightly, so did her confessor. Historians still argue whether Marjorie's experiences were true, mysticism, dramatized emotion, or something else entirely. But the fringe theory that keeps scholars up at night, that her visions masked or replaced a forbidden affection she dared not name. After all, she'd been married, borne children, and reportedly negotiated a chaste marriage with her husband after receiving divine instruction. But in one less known passage of her book, she describes a figure not Christ, but like him, who appears to her with a voice both gentle and known, who touched her, not with hands, but with thought. Some believe she may have loved a confessor or fellow pilgrim, or someone entirely outside the narrative, and wrapped her longing in holy metaphor to make it permissible. A 15th century cleric commenting anonymously on Marjorie's book wrote in the margins, "This is not mysticism. This is mischief dressed in piety." He also underlined every passage that mentioned bedchambers, which really tells you more about him than about her. She also reported jealousy, feeling upset when others received visions she didn't, or when priests dismissed her. In one vision, she scolds Christ, asking why he let her suffer so much for him, when others were treated more tenderly. It's the kind of plea you might expect from a jilted lover, not a cloistered nun. Yet she was never cloistered. That's the remarkable thing. Marjorie traveled on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to Santiago, to Rome, dressed in white like a nun, but officially bound by no order. Her spiritual marriage gave her an identity that allowed her to escape both wifely duty and convent walls. She crafted her own freedom in a time when women's lives were assigned, not chosen. And maybe, just maybe, her marriage to Christ was a way of declaring that no man on earth could ever own her again. Or maybe it was the only way she could speak of a love that left no letters, no names, just intense longing and pages soaked with tears. You sit now in a pew beside her memory. The church is quiet. Outside rain taps against the stained glass. Inside, a breeze catches the candle flame, and for a moment the shadows flicker like moving hands. And you wonder not what really happened, because that's lost, but how much love can be hidden in the language of holiness? How often passion gets rewritten as piety? And how many hearts like Marjorie's were too full to stay silent? Now you descend into the back rooms of medieval marketplaces, crowded with apothecary jars and curling scrolls, where the air crackles not with incense, but with something far more unpredictable magic, or at least something pretending to be. This is the realm of love spells, herbal tonics, and flirtations, whispered over bubbling cauldrons. Not witches, not exactly. Think more along the lines of cunning folk, alchemists, midwives, and backroom astrologers who claim to mend hearts, predict passion, and sometimes influence it. Tonight's forbidden love story doesn't unfold in a cathedral or castle, but in a cramped workshop lit by smoky oil lamps. At the table, a woman in a green wool robe, Madame Isabel, though that's almost certainly not her real name, and a young nobleman hunched over a scroll, hands trembling as he reads aloud a love charm that smells suspiciously of burnt time and regret. He's in love, you see, with someone he cannot name aloud. Perhaps a cousin's betrothed, or worse, a cleric's daughter. Maybe even someone entirely off limits. His voice cracks as he asks for a potion of persuasion. Isabel offers him a vial and a choice, the kind that sweetens the voice or the kind that softens the heart. He takes both, naturally. Historians still argue whether medieval love potions worked or even existed beyond placebo and suggestive packaging. But records from church trials are full of accusations, often laced with panic, about spiced wine laced with knowledge or papers inscribed with red symbols placed beneath pillows. One such trial from 1487 in Milan involved a merchant's wife accused of giving her husband a powder to keep him at home. She confessed but claimed it was only rosemary and honey given with prayer. The court wasn't convinced. She was fined and flogged. The husband ironically left her anyway. In university circles, alchemy was the high science of the day, mostly dedicated to transmuting metals and understanding the divine harmony of the universe. But some fringe practitioners quietly promised more tangible results. An anonymously written alchemical text from the 14th century includes this gem. If gold cannot be drawn from lead, perhaps love may be drawn from longing. Charming, utter nonsense, and yet there are love tokens, two tiny carved amulets buried beneath doorsteps, or silk ribbons dyed with herbs said to inflame desire. In some regions, girls would hide onion skins under their beds to dream of their future lovers. In others, boys slipped charms into a rival's drink to dull the edge of his appeal. You wander now into Isabel's back room, where shelves groan under clay jars labeled with both Latin and lies. One reads Cor Veneficum Poisoned Heart, another Dulcis Ardeo Sweetburn. There's no guarantee any of this worked, but there's power in the ritual, the giving, the risk, and sometimes, just sometimes, something did happen. A glance returned, a breath caught, a touch not withdrawn. Of course, when things went wrong, when a lady grew too obsessed or a marriage broke apart, the blame often fell on the spell. Convenient. Terrifying. Convenient again. One lesser-known chronicle from Rouen records a lord who banished his steward after the man looked too long upon his lady and had consulted a woman in the wood. Nothing more is said. But nearby a burned cottage appears in the land records listed as vacated by cause of unholy enterprise. The language of love and the language of magic, both murky, both dangerous, danced hand in hand in the medieval mind. And behind each whisper of sorcery there might have been just an ordinary heart, desperate for something forbidden. You leave the shop as the bell tolls midnight. The streets are empty. But in your pocket, you find a folded scrap of parchment you don't remember picking up. It reads, "Say nothing. The charm has already begun." Tonight, your feet crunch over dusty gravel as you walk a winding road, flanked by cypress trees and the murmurs of tired pilgrims. This is the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, and it's 1314. You carry only what you need: a satchel, a bedroll, and a question you're not ready to admit to anyone. Except maybe the stranger beside you. Pilgrimage was supposed to be sacred, a journey of penance, of reflection, of redemption. But what the bishops didn't print on the church posters was this: when you walk hundreds of miles across foreign lands with nothing but time and strangers, sometimes you don't just find God. Sometimes you find someone. The man beside you is from Flanders. Or maybe Brittany. It doesn't matter. His name is Jean. He has a chipped tooth and knows how to build a fire in the rain. You met 2 days ago after the innkeeper in Pamplona mistakenly booked you both into the same room. You apologized. He didn't. You shared the bread anyway. You've been walking together ever since. Pilgrims were supposed to be celibate, or at least restrained. But chronicles from the Middle Ages are full of stories that hint otherwise. One Flemish monk described the Camino as a corridor of both prayer and temptation, noting that many pilgrims arrived lighter of sin and heavier with child. You sleep in hostels or haylofts, always close but never touching. You talk about saints' blisters and the smell of garlic in Galician cooking, but your shoulders brush more often now. Your silences grow softer. One letter from a 14th century abbess warns against letting young nuns travel unchaperoned, lest they mistake a holy path for an earthly one. Historians still argue whether such warnings were based on fact or simply ecclesiastical anxiety, but in the preserved guest books of several hospitals de peregrinos, there are curious notes beside paired names arrived together. Departed separately, reunited on return. One entry, smudged and half erased, reads, "Only he wept when she sang in the orchard." I watched. Back on the road, Jean offers you an apple already sliced. His hands are chapped, his voice low. You find yourselves talking less about God, more about how the stars looked last night. He tells you he once thought love was something that happened only in castles and books. You tell him it sometimes happens in silence. And then near Leon, he confesses he's betrothed. Back home, a match arranged, a girl he barely knows. His voice cracks as he says her name like someone remembering the ending of a story they never chose. You don't say much, you nod. That night you sleep apart for the first time in days. And yet when you finally reach the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela, you feel his presence before you see him, waiting beneath the shadow of St. James, eyes wet, mouth set. You don't kiss, of course not. But your hands brush as you light a candle, and for one long moment nothing else exists. A few days later he leaves, back to his village, his duty, his life. You never learn what happened after. But years later, while visiting another shrine, you find a ribbon tucked into the stones beside the altar, faded blue tied with a knot you recognize. One theory about pilgrimage romance is that it offered people a pause from their assigned identities. For a brief moment, you weren't a daughter or a servant or a future wife. You were just a traveler, and someone saw you, not for who you were, but for who you were becoming. You arrive now in the quiet curve of a hillside village where the roofs are low, the lavender grows wild, and no one locks their doors in daylight. It's not a place for dramatic stories, at least not the kind that make it into history books. But it's here that you meet her, the widow. Her name in the parish rolls is Dame Matilda. Husband dead, 2 winters. Children grown, neighbors respectful. And yet she wears her mourning dress with a looseness that suggests she's not planning to wear it forever. One evening, just as the sun begins to flatten into orange over the fields, a knight arrives. No fanfare. No royal crest. just a weathered horse and armor gone dull with travel. He's not here on a quest exactly, he's been discharged. Landless, honorably dismissed from some long war that ended with very little glory and even less reward. His name might be Sir Renaud, but you're not sure. He tells no tales, just asks if there's work. Matilda offers him shelter, a place to rest. She's been tending the orchard alone after all. At first it's practical he repairs the barn roof. She brings him bread, he sharpens her shears. She offers him a second blanket. You know the rhythm, it's all terribly efficient. Until one morning you notice she laughs at his joke before he finishes it. And he lingers a little too long at the fence watching her walk away. Historians still argue whether widows in medieval Europe had more freedom than unmarried women or wives. In many places they did. A widow, especially one with land, could own property, make contracts, and, if clever, delay or refuse remarriage entirely. Some even chose lovers without bothering with weddings. One document from a Burgundian town council shows a widow fined, not for cohabiting with a man, but for doing so without the blessing of the church. Her defense: my house, my roof, my rules. The court was not amused. As for Matilda, her village knows. Of course they do, but no one says anything. The baker's wife offers a second loaf. The miller adjusts his cap. The priest chooses not to notice. Their romance is not dramatic. There are no poems, no letters, just ordinary tenderness, a hand on a shoulder during planting, a shared mug of cider, a quiet moment on the porch when the day ends and no one needs to say aloud what's happening, until he leaves, not by choice. A summons. A relative has died and a small inheritance beckons him back north. He promises to return. He means it. Matilda waits. 2 years pass, no letters, no rider on the road. People stop asking. She begins to wear her old apron again, plants basil where he once stacked firewood. Then one rainy morning he returns, older, paler, a limp in his right leg, but carrying a carved spoon she once admired wrapped in cloth. He doesn't speak for a long time. He just stands in her doorway, soaking wet, waiting. She says nothing, just steps aside. There's a property deed preserved in the region's records, signed in both their names, rare for the time. No mention of marriage, no priest. Just the quiet assumption that some things once chosen don't need to be spoken aloud again. You sit now beside their graves side by side, marked by a pair of simple stones. No grand epitaphs. Just the faint carving of an apple tree between them. Because sometimes love is not rebellion or tragedy. Sometimes it's a choice made once. Then again. And again. Every day after. Now you slip through the narrow streets of a medieval port town at night, where the lamps flicker low and shutters creak as they're drawn tight. Somewhere behind a curtained window, music plays soft, tired, and familiar. This is not the castle nor the convent. This is the edge of everything. And here on the edge lived the women no one wrote poems about. The prostitutes. The official term was often women of the stews, referring to the bathhouses where many worked. But their lives were more varied and far stranger than that label suggests. In many cities, brothels were legal, regulated, taxed. Their keepers signed contracts. The women were expected to wear distinctive colors or hoods. But behind that legality was something deeper, a world of double lives. You find yourself now in one of those places, a well-kept but fading building near a canal, where laughter floats through wood smoke and the scent of rosemary. Inside, a woman named Mariette sets down a wine cup and smiles not at you, but at a man sitting in the corner. He's no ordinary client. He's a bishop's secretary, or so he claims. She's heard worse lies, but his hands are too clean, his boots too new. He returns every week, never stays the night, always leaves a coin and a pressed flower. And when he speaks, it's rarely of pleasure, more often it's of poetry. Historians still argue whether these relationships were axe arrangements or real emotion wrapped in coin. But some preserved court records hint at women who once retired left with enough money and letters to suggest something deeper. One 15th century brothel ledger in Avignon lists a man who paid the same woman for conversation only for 5 years. In a marginal note, brings books, pays in advance, smiles often. Mariette in this moment walks the line. She knows the rules, she plays the role. But when he places a folded parchment on the table, she doesn't open it until he's gone. The note reads, "If I were not what I am, would you still offer me wine?" Quaint, pointless, but it sits folded in her bodice even days later. Some of these women had lovers who returned. Others didn't. Some bought taverns. Some married clients. Some disappeared into religious life, changed their names, and prayed for no one to recognize them. There are even records of women who moved between cities under aliases Madame Geneviève, in Paris becoming Sister Agnes in Tours. Same handwriting, same small drawing of a cat in the margins of her prayers. One document from Lubeck dated 1479 describes a woman named Lisbeth who confessed to having once loved a merchant she served weekly for 3 years. He paid well, she said, but he also remembered my mother's name. The scribe added, she seemed neither ashamed nor proud. And that's the thing. These weren't fairy tales, but they weren't always tragedies either. You sit now on a crumbling quay watching the moon ripple across the water. Somewhere behind you, footsteps echo. Not hurried, familiar. A rhythm that might have meant something once. In the morning, the street will forget her. The taxes will be collected. The laws will be enforced. But tonight, Mariette lifts the corner of a curtain and watches him disappear down the alley, her fingers tracing the edge of his note like a prayer she doesn't dare speak aloud. Not every love is written in gold leaf or carved into cathedral stone. Some live behind shuttered windows passed hand to hand like coins or silence or trust, and even those leave shadows. You find yourself now beneath the dim lamplight of a scholar's chamber in Cordoba, once one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. Shelves line the walls filled with scrolls and manuscripts in Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew. Outside, the air smells of orange blossoms and warm stone. But inside, a secret glows more fragile than candlelight. This is the story of a Jewish scholar. His name may have been Ezra or perhaps David, or perhaps his name has long since been lost in the margins. He lived during a time when Jews, Christians, and Muslims walked the same streets, bought fruit from the same vendors, and occasionally quietly fell in love. And that's where she enters. Some say she was the daughter of a Christian merchant. Others claim she was a convert born Jewish, baptized young, and raised in a monastery. The records disagree, but what they do agree on is that her name was written only once in the back of a manuscript on medicinal plants Anna of the River Path. She met the scholar in a garden where he was translating Galen, and she was delivering almond cakes for the apothecary. She asked about a plant. He answered with too much detail. She smiled. He forgot what the root was for. Their meetings became routine, always at dusk, always in the garden behind the scriptorium. He showed her how to read Hebrew script. She taught him a prayer in Latin. They laughed about the strange shape of fennel roots. Until one day a monk passed by and paused too long. After that, no more meetings. Historians still argue whether cross-religious relationships in Al-Andalus were common or exceptional. The ruling caliphate at times protected Jewish and Christian communities, yet social boundaries were firm and in some cases lethal. Inquisitions weren't just about theology. They were about fear, about bloodlines, and about the quiet terrors of love that crossed the wrong threshold. One lesser-known edict from Toledo in the early 1400s banned private instruction between persons of differing faiths in secluded spaces, a law clearly written in reaction to something that had already happened. In the margins of the scholar's copy of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, a short phrase is written in Andalusi Hebrew. Her hands were gentler than theory, her questions more precise than law. There's no signature, just the fading ink. In one version of the story, Anna was sent north, married off to a traitor never seen again. In another, she became a nun and spent her remaining years tending a hospital garden where she taught children to identify roots by their scent alone. The scholar. His trail ends with a petition for travel, likely seeking refuge in Naples. Attached to it is a list of possessions, clothing, books, and astrolabe, and one locked box labeled simply Private Prayers. You linger now in that old garden space. The walls are worn, the fountain dry, but a single stone bench still stands beneath the fig tree. And carved faintly into its edge are two initials stylized in different scripts, one Latin, one Hebrew. The carving is shallow, quick, perhaps unfinished, but still there. These loves were never meant to be written down. They were erased, legislated out of existence, or buried under laws that protected souls but punished hearts. Yet, in the shade of a fig tree where once two hands brushed while discussing translations, the air still hums, with words not spoken and names not forgotten. Now the candlelight fades into torchlight, and the tone grows darker as you approach the edge of medieval justice, a grim theater where passion and persecution blur until it's hard to know what anyone was really guilty of. You stand outside the stone chamber of a city court in 15th century France where a trial is about to begin. The charge heresy. But if you listen closely, you'll hear another word spoken in lower voices, love. Their names are Etienne and Rosamond, a cleric and a merchant's widow. Or maybe a soldier and a washerwoman. The accounts differ as they often do when scandal and fear mix. What is certain is that they were found together more than once outside city bounds. Witnesses saw them embracing. A discarded scarf was recovered, and then came the letters, always the letters. One parchment entered into evidence and copied by a scribe read, "The fire that warms us is no devil's trick, though others may freeze in piety." The inquisitor read it aloud to the court as proof of blasphemy. The crowd murmured, and the line was underlined twice in the trial book with the note unrepentant. Historians still argue whether this and other heresy trials were truly about religion, or simply tools to suppress inconvenient relationships, especially ones that crossed class, gender, or political lines. Many so-called heretics were just people who refused to live as quietly as expected. One chronicle from Rouergue describes a man and woman who read poetry together in the woods and denied the sacrament in favor of kisses. There's no record of their names, just the sentence, "They were burnt for their errors." May none remember them, but we do. Some fringe historians believe the rise in moral crackdowns during the late Middle Ages had less to do with doctrine and more with fear. Fear that people were falling in love outside the systems of control. Marriage contracts, dowries, piety, patriarchy. Love could unmake order. It could cross borders, ignore sermons, and worst of all, it could give people ideas. Etienne and Rosamond's trial dragged on for weeks. Their answers shifted from denial to silence to finally something resembling defiance. She is quoted as saying, "I would rather burn with him than be blessed alone." A dramatic line possibly invented later, but it appears in 3 different retellings, which makes you wonder. In the end, their fates were sealed not by fire, though some sources insist they were executed but by erasure. Their property was seized, their writings destroyed, their names scratched from the parish rolls. One sympathetic monk copied down a prayer in the back of a psalter for those whose love was deemed a sin but whose hands knew only grace. He never signed it. You step now into the ruins of the courthouse. It's long since collapsed, overtaken by ivy and time. But if you press your fingers to the old stone well where they were said to speak, before their final verdict, you'll find a heart-shaped indentation, weathered, yes, but unmistakably deliberate. Some say Rosamonde carved it with her belt buckle during her final night in the cell. Or maybe someone added it later, as a symbol, a defiance, a memory. Because sometimes the truth about love is not that it conquers all. It's that it survives even when it's forbidden, punished and forgotten by law. Especially then, you step now into silence. What remains of the monastery is a ruin of arches and windswept stones, where ivy snakes through cracks and crows nest where bells once rang. The world has long moved on from this place, but if you listen not with your ears, but with that deeper part of you that still believes in stories, you'll hear them. The lovers, not saints, not nobles, not even names in books. Just two figures in a legend passed through generations, the ghost lovers of the monastery ruins. The tale varies depending on who tells it. Sometimes they are two novices. Sometimes a scribe and a servant. Sometimes no names are given at all, only a glimpse of white robes, a trailing hand, or the low echo of voices that vanish as you turn the corner. But the essence is always the same. Two souls who loved in secret, perhaps too deeply, perhaps too soon, and paid the price for a tenderness the world could not accept. One local account scribbled in a 17th century traveler's notebook describes a boy who saw a pale man kneel beside the chapel ruins and kiss the air as if another face were there. The boy returned years later, older, skeptical, and still couldn't explain why he left a flower behind. The monastery locals say was abandoned, not because of war or famine, but after an unspecified scandal. The records burned, the stone left to crumble, but there's still a wall just past the cloister garden where two sets of initials are etched at ankle height. Tiny, hidden, worn nearly flat, yet unmistakably paired. Historians still argue whether the story is real, whether the hauntings began after the Reformation or before, whether the original transgression was romantic, spiritual, or political. But they all return to the same phrase found painted faintly on a crumbling wooden beam. We remained though they buried us in silence. Perhaps the most haunting thing isn't the idea that two ghosts walk here, but that no one knows their names and still, people bring them flowers. You walk the path now, your steps softened by moss and dirt. The sun has long since set and the stone glows faintly with moonlight. An owl hoots. The breeze carries the scent of crushed thyme and wet grass. You feel it before you see it, a hush. A pause. A presence. Not frightening, just waiting. Some say they appear to those who carry longing. Others say they only walk when someone has just said goodbye. But tonight they walk for you. Two silhouettes side by side. Not touching, but not apart. Moving slowly between the broken arches beneath the starlit sky. You don't call out. You don't follow. You simply stand and remember. Because not all forbidden love ends in tragedy. Some just never ends. Word count 1, 534. Wind down begins, and now the night grows deeper. The candles have guttered low, and the voices have faded back into the stones, into the fields, into the paper-thin veil between memory and dream. You've wandered through 20 quiet stories, some real, some barely remembered, all wrapped in the fragile truth of what people will risk to be near one another. Let your breath slow now. Think of the cloister garden where a veil lifted in moonlight. Think of the sea wall where a letter was left and never claimed. Think of the fig tree in a forgotten courtyard where no names were needed. Let those stories blur, now not disappear but dissolve. Melt like ink in rain, soften like parchment under fingertips. These lives once hidden now rest in the quiet space between heartbeat and sleep. You are safe now. There are no laws to fear here. No trials, no vows, no watchers. Just the warmth of a voice lingering in the stillness, and the knowledge that every whisper of love, no matter how forbidden, left a mark. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night. Sleep well.